Hi, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the All Hazards Consortium virtual discussion. We'll get started in about 2 minutes. Thanks for joining us today.
Laura, I'm going to try a headset real quick, so let me know if
No problem. I see people are starting to join us now, Tom, so we have a little bit of time.
Okay, good.
About a minute or so.
Welcome, welcome.
If you're just joining us, feel free to use your chat to say hi. We'd love to hear from you. Tell us your name and where you're from.
Hey, Laura, can you hear me?
Can hear you, yeah.
Awesome, okay.
Hey, it's Mike Prasad from New Jersey. We have Carol Adams from Pittsburgh. Welcome, guys. We'll get started in just a few seconds. Hi, Tim from Maryland Department of Commerce. Welcome. See what time we have. I have it at 4:30. So Chris, Tom, Dave, if you're ready, I'd love to kick it off.
Sure, ready when you are.
Okay.
All right, let me just close my chat box. Again, if you want to say hi and you're just joining us, feel free to type in your name and where you're from, and we'll say hello when we get a chance. Okay. Well, good afternoon. My name is Laura Johnson. I'm the Director of Conferences and Events for the All Hazards Consortium. Welcome back to those of you who've been to one of our webinars in the past. Tom and I were just counting earlier today. I stopped counting after 12, but I think this is about the 15th that we've brought dealing with business resiliency. This all stemmed from a 2-day conference we were going to do back, I think last week in June, and it got canceled to COVID. So we thought we'd bring the information to you piecemeal. And new topics keep coming up too. So it's been fun to create these for you. Today's topic focuses on-off data sharing and collaboration. And I'm here to help you with any questions that you may have. We're going to hold until the end to answer any questions. You can enter your questions to the panelists through the Q&A function of Zoom or through the chat room, and we'll have time for that at the end. And we'll also have time to unmute everyone's phone at the very end, and so you get a chance to say hi or ask your question verbally. So just a reminder to everybody that we are recording today's discussion. So we will send you a recording post-webinar for you to share with your colleagues or friends. And now I'd love to introduce our Executive Director, Tom Moran. Tom?
Hi, thank you, Laura. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, a little low, but you're good.
Okay, maybe, is this better? Is this better? Okay, I'll hold the mic up here. Sorry about that. Good afternoon, everyone. Very, very excited to have this conversation. We were talking this morning that this probably is going to be part 1 of a 3-part webinar series. Laura, take note. Today we're just going to touch on the surface of a really important topic, is public-private information sharing. This is kind of the elusive thing that a lot of people have been chasing. So I'm really glad to have Dave and Chris on the phone. They're very close to this issue within the All Hazards Consortium, specifically within the SISE. You might hear us mention the word SISE, S-I-S-E. It's a legal framework the private sector operates underneath the All Hazards Consortium as a way to legally create a framework to protect identity, information, and promote collaboration of operational information sharing, right? So this is run by the private sector, and they let government in based on certain use cases. Many of the use cases are just business to business. Some are business to government, and some are government to business. So the site's been developing since and private investment behind it. So it provides a safe environment to share and plan and respond to disasters and so forth. So you can register at siseusa.org. There's no cost. This will plug you into a number of capabilities and information that are there already. So with that, Laura, I'll turn it back. We can jump into our content today. And like I said, I'm really excited to get into this because it's new, it's innovative. and has certainly been tried and tested over the past, I guess, 4 or 5 years. Go ahead, Laura.
Thanks, Tom. Today's discussion is about an hour long, and joining us today is Tom, who you just met. We also have Dave Jones, who's the CEO of Storm Center Communications, and welcome back to one of our regular panelists, Chris McIntosh, who's the CEO of Ben Ear Solutions. Today, we're going to ask our panelists about 4 questions about on-off data sharing, and then, as I mentioned earlier, we'll have time for some questions at the end. So Dave, I'm going to start with you. And you know, when Tom asked me to put this particular discussion together, I didn't even know what on-off meant. So if you can take a moment to first introduce yourself. Secondly, tell us a little bit about what that means for those online who might not know. And then we're going to jump into question number 1, which is what are some of the problems that industry is having sharing sensitive operational information with government or other groups? So Dave?
Sure. Well, thank you, Laura, and it's a pleasure to be back here for my second webinar with All Hazards Consortium. And you're right, Tom, this has been sort of an elusive sort of thing. And really, what I do at Storm Center and what Storm Center does, we work a lot with federal agencies and also with private sector organizations to really help them understand how to use science data, how to access science data and put that to work so we can have a much more robust decision-making environment. And in order to do that, it takes information sharing. And so we answered a call from the federal government about 2011 to start addressing the issue of how do federal agencies access and share data and how can they do that across all platforms. So that's kind of what's come around to today in having us focus on the benefits of on-off data sharing because in today's world, it's very complex to access information, to share it. Some people don't want to have it hanging out there and all that stuff. So that's what this discussion is about today, and how can you turn data sets on and turn them off and have them disappear on people's web browsers or platforms so we can really improve the entire decision-making environment so people can get exposed to new data sets as well, maybe ones they've never heard about before or don't know are available from the federal government or perhaps other private sector organizations. How can we bring that information together in a decision-making environment and focus that information on the hazard or situation at hand so people just aren't inundated with the tons and tons of data that are coming, and it's more and more each day.
Right. Okay, thank you so much. Chris McIntosh, I'd love for you to say hi and let the listeners know a little bit about yourself and if you can address this question as well.
Hi, everybody. Hey, Laura, good to see you again. Chris McIntosh with Ben Ear Solutions. We work with a lot of folks in all different areas to improve their ability to use technologies to do just this, share information with each other in real time. People we work with are grappling with serious problems and trying to answer serious questions, usually under serious conditions. So this is a really important area of focus, and I'm so glad the All Hazards Consortium is doing that. Part of the problem has been, if I want to share information A to B, there's a lot of ways of doing that. But the assurance that that information won't be shared from B to C is what's been missing, and that often stifles people's desire or willingness to share information with each other. It's that security of, how do I make sure that my information isn't getting out to places where I don't want it? And unfortunately, many of us have been burned by sharing information, and next thing it's on the 5 o'clock news or something like that. And that really throws a wet blanket on the information sharing environment, which we so desperately need to better respond and deal with these disasters. It's not just government classified, and using the broader term classified, FOUO, law enforcement sensitive, all that type of information we're talking about, but we also have to respect and be aware of proprietary information, competitive information, personal identifiable information, those kind of things. And all of those have valid reasons to not want them released to a broader community. So the problem that we're working on solving here as a group through the All Hazards Consortium is one of the big ones. I've been in meetings at the White House about this very issue. It's all the way at that level. You know, the technology's there now. We used to have to try and do this despite the technology, but now the technology is there, and it's the policy that has to catch up. So, so you're going to hear, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the technologies that are available, how they work in the current environment with a lot of tools that are out there. And we'll talk a little bit about what else needs to happen that's maybe not technology driven in order for information sharing to be effective. So I'm really excited to be on this panel. Thank you, Tom and Laura, for inviting me.
Yeah.
Work with Dave for a number of years, and there's some exciting things coming.
Yeah, and Laura, just a comment. On the call today, we've got probably, I think, half the folks are in government, half are in private sector. Chris brings a history with Virginia as a state coordination officer there for interoperability. So his perspective has really been helpful. The big issue is trust. Trust of people, of process. And what we'll try to address today is just touch on some of the things that the private sector's experimented with working with states. But at the, you know, from a North Star standpoint, it's about building trust, because everybody jumps to technology to solve the problem. But as I heard somebody say, Tom, if I don't trust you, I'm not going to lend you my lawnmower, let alone my data. And it's so true. You know, I use a dating analogy all the time. It's exactly what it's like. You know, if anybody's ever been, this is very, it's a process. So I think that's why we're going to have to break this up into a couple of webinars, because we're just going to skim the surface. But if you're in the private sector, you're going to learn about a way you can actually share data, protect it, know who's seeing it, and for how long. They can't share it. They can only know it, and then it's gone. There's no record of it. This was designed by the Fleet Response Working Group years ago. So there's a lot of factors. The idea is to reduce risk, find ways to do it, and then move forward. But the big problem is trust, because there's humans involved and there's risk. So people are mostly risk averse. So, you know, by breaking this down into small bites, you'll see kind of how the private sector has done it within the SISE.
All right, Tom, thanks so much. All right, we're going to move on to our next question, which is, how does the SISE and on-off data sharing attempt to address the problems that we just talked about? So Chris, if I can start with you on this one.
So there's two. There's well, more than two, but two main ones. One is, how do we create an environment, and Tom nailed it, a trusted environment where people can share information, where the policies and the technologies align to provide the capability to share information, both with specific people under specific circumstances, and more broadly under a more broad scenario. So how do I share information, gather and share information with the broader community, like is happening a lot with COVID? Or how do I share information with just a couple people who are working together to solve a specific problem, such as a utility and a government agency and a telco who are all trying to do damage assessment, and all their wires are mixed together out there in the trees? So those types of scenarios require different approaches, but need to operate within the same environment, bound by the same trust framework, as Tom is so good at articulating, but also has access to the right tools to facilitate and create that information sharing. So that's how this comes together. In the past, Bleeding Edge had two ways of sharing data. You had, I'm making my data public, which means it goes to everybody. or I share it with somebody very specific in some terminology, a named user, such as Tom Moran, which means I can't share it with his organization, or I have to do a lot of account management and credential management in order to add people very quickly. I used to work with Esri's disaster response program. We used to have to batch load up named users because all of a sudden all these other people wanted to share information in an organization, but we did not want to make it public for everybody. So that in between is where we're at now. How do I share information with an organization, with a group of people, without sharing it with everybody? And that's what the SISE is about sharing information with the right people at the right time, the right way. And so that's what we're working on here with this initiative, is solving that problem. I'm sure if there's any GIS managers on the call, they know what I'm talking about having to upload a bunch of users right at the beginning of a disaster and manage all of those accounts and not having enough licenses and all that kind of thing. Those problems stifle information sharing. So we're looking at other ways to solve that problem.
Okay, Chris, thank you so much. And Tom, you talked a little bit about the SISE at the beginning of today's virtual discussion. How does the SISE attempt to address the problems that we talked about in question number 1?
So, great. Thank you, Laura. So the SISE is really a creature of the private sector. So when I say the SISE does this, it is really hundreds of companies that have had representatives advise, participate. Electric, communications, food, fuel, working groups and committees really designed this. So the first thing, the SISE groups didn't invent anything. They borrowed a process used by the Defense Industrial Base, which had 50 million people using it worldwide, to partition data and people from the kind of a honeycomb approach where, people and data were segmented by a cell and nobody got to see everything else. And so they've been using this for decades. So in the early days, back in 2015, the SISE was built around that model, slimmed it down a little bit. We didn't have a 40-page legal agreement. We had a 2-page legal agreement. Our agreement was with states and utilities, not just with companies. So what the SISE did first was set up a process to separate data and people. Then it's established a multi-tiered vetting process where people could be vetted without being issued a credential. So we wouldn't have to do what Chris was talking about, is how do you onboard 300 people in 2 minutes? Okay. Well, we didn't have time to do, the vetting and onboarding. So we borrowed a lot of that. So it vets people. So everybody comes in through the same door. That's the siseusa.org website. And that allows you to tell us a little bit about who you are and what your areas of interest in. And we have to believe you. Okay. We don't check that in step 1. Okay. In step 2 and 3, we actually validate that. And that's a separate process. But what the SISE does is vet people and information so that we make sure it's accurate. And we have a system. Dave Jones was very instrumental in developing a system with NASA and Karen Moe and the ESIP Federation called an ORL ranking system. It's the Operational Readiness Level Model. NASA has a 9-step process. The private sector saw that. Dave brought it to the group. They said, 9's too many, let's do 4. And they put together a ranking system that ranks data. 1 is ready to go. It's operationally meets the 10 requirements. 4 is crowdsourced, not quite there. You can use it, but at your own risk. The idea was to create a mechanism so data could be ranked, so people could trust it. Because one of the private sector folks, I'll never forget, he said, Tom, I waste half my day validating information people have given me to make a decision about. He said, if you all can do that if you can validate that and teach me how you're doing it, I'm all in. So this was just a process, Laura, 1 step at a time. It wasn't like, hey, we got this great idea, let's do it. This took many trial and error. And you have to be able to take risks and fail and start over. And so we've been through many iterations of that. But at the end of the day, the SISE vets people, vets data, and organizes data. The last piece is by use case. So what do I mean by use case? Use case is a problem. So if any of you have been involved in problem solving, one problem begets two more, and those two beget five more. And next thing you know, you wonder, what the hell are we in this meeting about? You can't even remember why people came together, because the problems all get solved, all get mixed up. So what the private sector did in their wisdom was, let's focus on one problem at a time. And if we pick up all the ones along the way, they go in a parking lot, we come back. And so then we identify a problem and we develop a 6-step process, which we published, our use case development process, which outlines what's the problem, everybody agrees, what's the risk, what's the impact rather, what's the data, who are the people involved, what's the sensitivity of the data, and then what are the possible solutions, which never end. So by vetting people, ranking and organizing data, and building it by use case, individual problems, people could zero in on the use case they wanted to be part of and avoid getting sucked into things that were irrelevant to them. So the defense industrial base did a wonderful favor for us. They provided a model. We just took it and operationalized it, working with states and industry. We're not there yet by any stretch, but it's come a long way.
All right, Tom, thank you so much. Dave, Tom talked about the process. Can you tell us a little bit about where you came in that process, and how would you address this particular slide?
Sure. No, that's a great question, Laura. And as Tom was talking and Chris was talking, I was thinking, boy, it's, if you can envision a 4-lane highway and then having to plan another 4-lane highway to merge in to that highway to get traffic to flow smoothly 5 or 6 years down the road, you have to do a lot of planning. And as Tom and the All Hazards Consortium was putting the SISE together and really building that trust framework, and Chris was working on really putting technologies together that can help people make decisions, we were answering a grand challenge from the federal government. And that grand challenge back in 2010 and 2011 was, how do federal agencies access and share data? Because they don't do it. They might access data, and remember this was back then, they might access data, but they certainly didn't share it because they weren't able to. So we spent a number of years working on the issue and testing, and then going back and developing, and then retesting and developing for about 4 years a data sharing capability. But what happened was, when we did some testing with FEMA, it wouldn't make it through their firewalls. So we went back to the drawing board and addressed this grand challenge from the federal government under the Small Business Innovation Research Program. And so we developed a capability to do this kind of on-off data sharing, and we tested it, iterated through it, and all that stuff. We brought it to the All Hazards Consortium. Tom said, this is awesome, let's do some testing. And then that's really what helped evolve the capability, because the input from the SISE members has said, you know what, this has some legs. What about, can it do this or can it do that? And so we kept evolving it. And so now through this federal government funding through NASA, we're now sole source status with every federal agency in the US government to help them understand data sharing and collaboration, and to bring that kind of capability to them. So now we're seeing that 4-lane merge right into the highway, the super highway, so we can really turbocharge all of the work that's been done over the last several years on data services, on standing up GIS infrastructures. And now we can start to address the ability of, how do you take that critical information and put it in front of decision makers when those decision makers have no idea that certain data may be out there? So how can you put data in front of people that's relevant to their data sharing environment or their decision-making environment, and then make them turbocharge their decision-making, so we can really save lives, protect property, get utility vehicles out faster to restore power? It all results in saving lots of time and lots of money. And just, real quickly, a quick little example is, we helped a federal agency a couple of months ago identify different data sources and put them in front of an analyst at one time. And the person said to me, you know what, they spend 40 to 45% of their time looking for the right data. And that's a significant cost over one analyst's time. And so by bringing that data together in a geospatial environment, now they can spend that 40 to 45 minutes and really do additional analysis, which can provide a better product.
All right, let me tell a little story about how quickly the private sector adopts. January 2016, Winter Storm Jonas was upon us. Well, in February of 2014, one of our states called me and said, hey, you guys need to look at this system that was developed by NASA as a weather system. And so we just weren't ready. Fast forward January 2016, I get a call from Dave. Hey, Tom, Dave Jones, Storm Center, the technology we had. So I remember calling Chris Eisenbray. Dave put some data on the screen. We had a big electric sector fleet movement getting ready to happen. And I called Chris Eisenbray at Edison Electric Institute and said, hey, Chris, I got something that looks promising. Can you jump on a webinar? So about 6:30, we jump on a webinar. Chris said, okay, let's test it out. And that thing went operational in about 30 minutes. That one little tweak, we had been searching for a way to coordinate 30 states and probably 100 plus companies. And all we had was email and proprietary software systems. Not everybody had Esri, not everybody had WebEOC. It was a nightmare, right? And with this one little tweak, we were able to do that. And the private sector said, you know what? Thank you, NASA, for that $5 million investment. Okay, let's leverage that. And that's how quickly they were able to look at the data, test it, operationalize it in an evening. Now, it had to improve, which they did over time, but that's the beauty of what the private sector, if they see operational value, it helps solve a problem, they jump on it, okay? The question is, what's the use case, so forth. So there was no like magic button we pushed. This all came thanks to our states who basically turned us on to this. We would have never heard about it. And we're always looking for anybody on this webinar. We're always looking for solutions to answer our use case issues. We don't have the answer. We just work the people side of the problem. But anyway, that's a story that I think it's a great story for NASA and their investment and how we ended up connecting to Dave because of our states.
All right, thanks so much, Tom. So, Tom, I'd love to address this question to you. Can you give examples of how the capabilities we just talked about can be used or have been used in major disasters?
Sure. As I mentioned before, is this okay? Or can
yeah,
you hear me?
You're good.
Okay. As I mentioned before, every disaster breeds a set of issues or problems, every one. And so somebody has to sit kind of in the crow's nest and record all these so you can work them when you're in blue sky day, right? So one of the first ones we were wrestled with was December 2013. There was a major ice storm hitting Oklahoma and Texas, big one. I mean, we're talking inches of ice, massive power outages. And we had crews pretty much from every utility on the eastern side of the country moving westward to get there to help through their mutual aid process to get the power back on. The electric sector has a wonderful process they've developed over 30 plus years through their Regional Mutual Assistance Group program. So the trick was a lot of these crews, as they move from Connecticut and Florida and North Carolina, towards tech, they run into all kinds of delays, toll stations, way stations, construction zones, reroutes, traffic out. There's all kinds of issues. And during Sandy, we learned that, for every hour those crews are delayed, it can daisy chain into 24-hour start restoration time. So, daisy chain is important because they're only allowed to drive so many hours and so forth. Well, anyway, so at that time, we didn't have a process to do this. So we put information together, attached it to an email, and we basically had a conference call with all the states. Hey, these crews are moving. We put it out there. Well, anyway, it worked very effectively. The states, some of the states actually met the crews at the border and gave them a police escort. It was really fascinating to see the region come together. But because it was email, some of that information got into the wrong hands, non-operational hands, and caused some real issues. Okay, like what? Well, not in this specific case, but utilities don't want people to know where those trucks are because they may bed down at a hotel and crews steal the copper off, not crews, but gangs steal the copper off the trucks, right? They just don't want that information out. It's operationally sensitive. And there's a lot of other reasons. And that was like, okay, we got to fix this. since that time, we've been able to use the SISE to build over 80 plus use cases that resolve issues in situational awareness, decision making, research, focusing research dollars to a specific issue, garnering data sets. During Hurricane Florence, there was a call out from the private sector that, hey, we need high water vehicles, a lot of flooding, North Carolina during Florence. Well, we have this big community of people. So we've just learned over time that you got to validate the requirements. So when we made the phone calls back through the electric sector, we found that it wasn't necessarily like big tank military high water vehicles. It was track driven vehicles is what they needed. And so now that we knew what they needed, 2 hours later, we were able to crowdsource basically every distributor, manufacturer of those types of vehicles everywhere in the country. And we're able to get that back in place within a couple hours. So we didn't do that, just the network of people working together do that. But without that trust framework the SISE provided, when we wouldn't know what the real requirement was because we wouldn't know who to call. Two, we could crowdsource it with trusted people, not just anybody, right? And three, we were able to get that information in a couple hours. And FEMA, Region 4, actually called and said, hey, listen, thank you. You guys saved us hours of cycles going up, because FEMA goes up a protocol, FEMA region, then FEMA headquarters, then the DOD, and the DOD comes back and say, yeah, we can do it, but it's going to be a couple of days. And so it was a good example of how the SISE can, using vetted people and organized information, how it can bring some of these results very quick. Not for everything, but for a lot of these use cases that come up. And every storm breeds new ones, every one. COVID was a great example. I'll end with this. One of the issues during COVID was we had all states were issuing policies that were for good purpose. They were to protect citizens, stop the spread of the virus, and they closed bars and restricted movement and so forth. Well, what nobody anticipated was the unintended impacts on commercial movement, right? Drivers from out of state weren't sure they wanted to go into a city or through a state or stop at a rest stop, or where the heck are the rest stops that are open? So there was all these issues going on. So we had been working with DHS CISA and Idaho National Labs. And the first thing we did was work with Chris McIntosh and Dave, and we put together a Esri information portal, right? What we did was validate all the data sources. We screened about 40. We ended up with about 6 that were good data sources for all kinds of information. So we had this portal that was used by the Fleet Working Group and healthcare and work with Healthcare Ready and another organization. So we were all working off the same page. Well, in one phone call, there was an issue. The private sector drivers needed to get access to that information so they could actually get a route from A to B and know which route to take that was the least restrictive based on state policy, right? So it wasn't a routing app to make turn. Okay, it's hey, go through this state. You have more green paths than red paths, right? 10 days. Idaho National Labs developed that with DHS CISA. We got it out there, tested it, and we got it approved, and it's out there now, cra.inl.gov, cra.inl.gov. That whole thing came about in about 10 days. It took DHS about 2 weeks to approve that because you have to go through the legal review and things like that. Now we're working with USDOT and other things to add more capability to that, so it addresses more clarity to the routing part. But this is just a powerful thing when there's an environment of trust. Boy, people can do anything when they work together and know each other and trust each other. So those are just some examples, Laura, of a couple of scenarios of how the SISE works, especially during COVID. It was produced 6 or 7 operational products in 3 months, right? Not the SISE, it's the people because they trust each other. That's it.
Right. Thanks, Tom. And if you wouldn't mind typing in the URL that you just mentioned into the chat for all the participants.
Sure, yeah.
Hey, Chris, Tom was pretty comprehensive in his answer, but you want to provide any additional examples of the capabilities of what we're talking about?
Well, Tom really did a good job of focusing on the positive. I'm actually want to take this and flip it. And here's what's not happening with COVID, because we have not moved the ball forward enough with like I said, the tools are there. You're not getting bed count data from Health and Human Services. You're not getting case trend data. You're not getting anything that remotely smells of PII which this is a healthcare emergency. It's a binary conversation. Has PII in it? Nope, not sharing. And that's personally identifiable information. There's no conversation about how to remove the PII and share the parts of the information that are shareable. There's so much information available in silos of excellence in these hubs that are being stood up by various federal and government agencies that they're not sharing with the community. With private sector data that is, unless you want to pay for it, because there's no way for them to share it with you for a small amount of time during a disaster. All of these things are not happening right now. And it's we helped stand up a hub for the All Hazards Consortium, and there is a lot of data out there that we wanted to get that we couldn't because of a policy or a procedure or a lack of trust from an external organization. So we've gone a long way, but we have a long way to go. And that's why we continue to work on this, is because I'll guarantee you, and I saw a list of who registered for this webinar, and it's a really great cross sector of people. I'll guarantee you there's information out there that you would like to have that you can't get right now. And that is not because the technology is the obstacle anymore. So that's why we do what we do, and we'll keep working on it because we can definitely do better.
So Tom, is this a mission of the All Hazards Consortium?
Yeah, I think the consortium's mission is really to prepare the region to better respond and recover from any type of disaster, physical, cyber, what have you. What we just kind of zeroed in on was information sharing, because that seems to be the common denominator. And it's funny, Laura, so many things disrupt this. You know, I know Laura's in state government. I'm in industry. We can build a relationship with friends. Then there's an election. Laura's gone. Now what? Okay, Dave replaces her. Okay, now I got to meet Dave, and so it's just constant cycle through disruptions of trust, and it's hard. That's not a critique of government or industry. It's really hard. So I think the SISE was needed because it provided that legal framework for private sector to own, operate, fund, and sustain while government can transition, which is natural, and people retire in the private sector. So yeah, the mission is, how do we better share information and solve problems versus just share information, right? So yeah, I think sensitive operational information sharing is the vehicle to get to the mission, which is prepare the region to better respond, right? Or the nation, depending on what the use case is.
Okay, thanks so much, Tom. Hey, Dave, I wanted to put this question towards you and if you have anything to add to this particular slide.
Well, again, as Chris was talking and Tom was speaking as well, it brought me back to, not only are relationships being built within the SISE, but even at Storm Center Communications, we've been working a lot with NASA, with NOAA, with other agencies and organizations. I mean, for example, the ESIP Federation, the Federation of Earth Science Information Partners, they really helped to put together the approach for operational readiness levels, those ORL levels that we're now putting into practice. I'm the co-chair of the Disaster Lifecycle Cluster, along with Karen Moe, who recently retired from NASA. And we're constantly looking at that life cycle of data from collection, whether it's from a satellite or whether it's from a crowd source, and how does that data get processed and made available to be accessed and shared on a broad basis to really focus in on specific use cases. And so as we put the Fleet Response Working Group together and the site together for people to access map-based information, we're using on-off data sharing all the time because when things develop, we just turn on data sets that are relevant to that particular issue, whether it's a tropical storm, whether it's, like Tom said, an ice storm, or a system like Sandy, or it's something more related to grid outage from solar storms or things like that. We have the data sets that we can then turn on and make relevant to those data sharing environments. So I think COVID-19 has really thrown everybody obviously for a loop, but I can tell you what we've seen during COVID-19, and that is an explosion of data and an explosion of data services. So the other thing that you need to do is you need to dive into that and say, what data sources do we trust? Which ones are we going to put out there for people to make maybe hundreds or thousands or $10,000s or $100,000 decisions based on information that they're accessing through the SISE. So that's why building all these relationships over the multiple years has really gotten us right into the heart of key decision making environments and key data processing environments. So we can not only put that to work, but give them feedback on how they can improve those products, whether they're from the government or the private sector. And on the government side, we can say, look, can you guys provide some data analytics, some automated intelligence processing to go along with this, so we can say, hey, when will this road be flooded so we don't get crews stuck? Or when will this road not be flooded so we can get crews in to start restoring power? So there's a lot, like Tom said, there's a long way to go, but we are right on it. And the most important thing about that is the partnership with the SISE members giving us that input.
And Dave, that's a great segue to our next and last question before we move on to the demo you have. But you talked a little bit earlier about relationships with the federal government and the challenge we received from them and data sharing. But can you be more specific about the partnership, the people you've worked with within the federal government to get to where we are today with this?
Sure. No, that's great. Thanks, Laura. I mentioned NASA and NOAA that we've worked with, but specifically like the National Weather Service, we work with them to access their data, to provide it in ways that we think are valuable for decision makers. And then we get feedback, whether or not these products have been used correctly, whether or not they need enhancements, and we can provide that feedback to the National Weather Service. At the same time, we work with the NESDIS side, the National Environmental Satellite Data and Information Service side of NOAA. They operate all the satellites, right? billion-dollar satellites that are up there orbiting, constantly monitoring the Earth and getting environmental intelligence. So we're working with NOAA on the satellite side to say, hey, look, we can see outages of power. We can look at lights at night from these satellites and see who's been impacted by storms. We can look at fires and see early indications of heat signatures in the woods, so we can detect wildfires at a very early stage and then put that information into a model and predict where it's going to be spreading, where the smoke is going to be spreading, and how does that smoke impact breathing on the ground. So you have a lot of firefighters, a lot of emergency responders responding to that smoke, and we can now visualize that smoke in a forecast and indicate whether or not you need masks to breathe, whether or not it's going to be choking, smoke. And that's really helping responders on the ground. So any of these federal agencies, and look, they're under mandates to, number one, share their data and put more federal data to work. So at the same time they're trying to do that quickly, we're trying to put it to work in an operational environment like the SISE, so we can provide feedback back to them to improve those products.
All right, Dave. Hey, Tom, Dave talked about some federal partnerships. I know for you, a lot of that was the state partnerships. I'd love to give you the floor to talk about this a little bit more.
Yeah, I'm starting to sound like a father because I'm talking about how long I've been doing this. So 16 years I've been at this. And one thing that I've learned, well, if probably hopefully more than one, is you can't fix anything without the states involved. You can have all the private sector, the trade associations, all the councils, all the federal agencies, they can all be, but if you are not connected to that state, it's very difficult to fix things. Why? Because they have dominion over the roads, the infrastructure access, which is critical. They know things that are going on within the communities. And it's hard because they're the least resourced of most government entities, but they have all the responsibility to own and fix the problem. It's really kind of sad. it's almost upside down. No disrespect to how it all comes together, but it's hard. And some states get hammered all the time, and other states don't see a lot of declarations, right, or activations. So, and they all process differently. So each state is unique. You can say, well, we have relationships with, you know, a bunch of states, but they're all unique, and you have to keep them refreshed because elections cause turnover, and this is very, very disruptive to the process. The other thing I think is important with states, and Dave touched on it, the more we do information sharing, the more I'm learning. There's no one tool, and there's never going to be one data set. There's never going to be one of anything. It's just not the way human organizations work. And so what we try to do is to take a collage of information to determine the situation. Like Dave mentioned, power outages. We were working early on a use case to determine power outages. And finally, we just said, you know what, forget it. It's too dynamic. The private sector is all they can do to keep up their public websites. But, you know, in 20 minutes it's changed, right? So we got off of that. So we started to look at, okay, not so much is power and when's it coming back on, but where is it, right? And the use cases we work on is how do we remove obstacles to get crews in there to turn the power back on, okay? And we use 5 data sets just for that one use case, right? So somebody says, well, how do you determine if a gas station's open and has fuel? Well, we took a different approach, right? Is there toilets flushing there? Maybe there's water data we can use, okay? Is there a cash register? Is there financial transaction data? Maybe that's a data set we can use. Is the distributor of the fuel, whose livelihood depends on that station being open and knowing that? Maybe that's a third data set. Is there area of photographs? So the point is these partnerships give you a collage of data, which gives you a much better fidelity of the problem. Because to go after one and saying, whoop, we got it, we got the answer, we got one data set. No, it's just bigger than that. And that's why you need these partnerships are so critical, federal, state, and local, as well as trade and private sector, because every sector has a different angle on the same problem. That's why these partnerships round it out.
All right, Tom, thanks so much. Chris, what are some crucial relationships you've developed through your work in this?
Well, the public-private ones, you can't even put a value on how those are, because all the way back to my time in the Emergency Operations Center in Virginia, the critical infrastructure is owned and operated by the private sector. They have the information that the government needs in order to facilitate response and recovery. So those relationships and many of those relationships were fostered through my long relationship with Tom and the All Hazards Consortium, have been absolutely invaluable to what we've been able to do and what we're trying to do. Relationships too with other associations are super important, because associations can serve as a focus point for their membership to provide information, and then they can aggregate what's going on across their membership and then share that with other groups instead of having to go to each single individual member.
Yeah, they have the outreach.
They have the outreach, they have the connections, and so when you start adding networks together from associations, you end up with a whole greater than the sum of the individual parts. So those two things, beyond what's already been mentioned, have been super important in developing those partnerships.
All right, Chris, thanks so much. Okay, I'm going to stop my screen share and hand things over to Dave Jones, who's going to do a quick demo on GeoCollaborate.
So let me jump in and set this up so everybody knows what we're talking about here. So I sent out a link to a little video, kind of a chalk talk. We use these all the time. I'd encourage you all to watch that. You're probably sick of hearing my voice. I'm sorry, but that's just the fastest way we know how to get this out. The requirement for what the Fleet Working Group needed was a way to share information for a period of time with a vetted community. And if I own the data, I control who sees it and for what purpose and for how long. And so there's a lot of public information out there. That's not the data that the SISE tries to get. The SISE tries to get data that is not publicly available, stuff that is not shared openly. Why? Because that's the data decision makers need to make critical decisions. Where are the locations of these things? Where is something open and closed based on sensitive information? So what I asked Dave to do was to put together kind of an actual, it's a demonstration, but it's an actual way of how we share private information that is behind a firewall, but through this technology that was created by NASA with Dave, allows us to share that for a period of time outside the firewall you with me, so that we can get people on the same page. The whole idea is, think of this as a tool we use now in the Fleet Work Group to coordinate 10, 20, 30 states with 100 companies at the same instant, without everybody not having to have the same Esri license or web EOC. And you can imagine there's 80 tools within our framework that we've counted, and we needed one. And so that's where this technology fits that bill. And if there's other things out there, we're wide open. But we wanted to show you what does sensitive information sharing look like. So I would encourage all of you, I'll put the URL in the chat area, Dave.
Sure.
You guys can go to that URL. It's open. There's no login. And this is how we use to coordinate people live, real time, across multiple systems. And you can follow along as well, or you can watch the screen. So I wanted to give you all that backdrop as far as what we use this for, as a way of sharing sensitive information that's not public for a period of time. In this case, 5 minutes, okay? And then we turn it off, okay? And it disappears from your screen. So it's simple, it's elegant, but it's hard to explain until you see it. So Dave, I'll turn it over to you, and then I'll type in the chat area which website you want me to send them to, just FRWG?
FRWG with the follow on the end. So it's just
Okay.
frwg.geocollaborate.com/follow.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Go ahead, Dave.
Sure. Oh, well, thanks, Tom. And what you see on your screen, I'm going to explain before anything happens. On the left-hand side is the leader who has entered credentials, and that's me. I'm controlling this map on the left-hand side, and you can see that GeoCollaborate is turned on. Now, in the chat, Tom shared the address that you can click on. And if you click on that frwg.geocollaborate.com/follow link, you'll see a map load up, and you'll see an on-off switch in the upper left-hand side. And you can see you'll come to this map here. GeoCollaborate is not turned on. But as you can see, as a leader, I'm looking at the southeast, and as soon as I turn GeoCollaborate on, this map is going to zoom to match my map as a leader.
And Dave, let me jump in. If you notice, there was no login. There's no credential. Why is that? The private sector did not want to have to remember one more freaking username and password, right? Because when it hits the fan, you're trying to find the email. Well, good luck. There's 400 emails in your inbox, right? So one of the requirements for this was, don't give me a freaking username and password, just get me to the screen. So Dave was able to work this out with NASA. So the first thing is there's no login for the period of time the session's open, right? Now we have private ones that do require login, but this was the public one. So it's a little thing, Dave, but it was a big thing when you got 500 people that need to sync up in the same instant.
Yeah, that's a good point, Tom. And also you can connect to this URL on any device. So you can do real-time collaboration and data sharing on a tablet, a laptop, a desktop computer, or a mobile phone. And you can just activate GeoCollaborate and follow what the leader is doing. So I'm going to make this really quick, whether you're following by connecting to the URL. And if you're watching the video after this live demonstration, it won't work because we're doing this live. So don't worry about connecting to the follow. But you can also connect to the dashboard as well. But I'm going to go and turn on a data set, which is the open closed data set showing where data sets that the SISE is collecting is showing where stores are open and closed. So all these blue dots here, you can see I could zoom out and it'd be the whole country. This data set is coming from the SISE Esri hub, and we're sharing it out in real time to the follower on the right-hand side, or if you're following live back on your device. So if I zoom into an area like, say, southern North Carolina, you'll see that the follower is following me in real time. So here's the big difference between this and screen sharing. I can interrogate this data as a leader, and I can say, oh, look, here's a Delhaize that's open on 1202 West Broad Street in Elizabethtown, North Carolina. But if you go to the follower on this screen, they can also interrogate the data. You cannot do this in a screen sharing environment. So we're actually sharing the data. And the key is that none of the followers or users of the dashboard can download and save the data. So this has very significant impacts to private sector data sharing into public environments. You can't FOIA the data in a public sector environment.
Right.
So this is an example on the follower side of all that data. If I zoom out again, then the follower is going to follow me and go get the same data in a broader geographic area.
So one of the things the private sector wanted to do was to be able to log in at 8 o'clock in the morning, get a brief, then come back at 6 o'clock at night and get a brief, right? So what this capability allowed them to do is to turn it off, come back in, turn their button on, and the data refreshes as long as that session was open. So they could always get the latest information, okay? The second requirement for this was, if you notice a little window on the right side, gives you, lat long and maybe a phone number like that. But in the SISE, there's 3 tiers of data. So the first tier is location, lat long, address. The second tier is status. Well, we validate status with a couple of methods. We have partners. Saber's a great example. Jim Morentz at Saber does a great example of validating status with people putting that in. It's great. There's many ways to do that. So status is one we are still looking at how we best do that, either with partners, or whatever. But the third one is where we want to get to, and that's inventory. So we just want to know, not that a store is there, it's open, but does it have insulin? Does it have milk? Does it have key resources, right? We're working that right now with PPE. We have a data set, it's private, it's PPE distributors and providers nationwide. And we're working through getting inventory on hand that can be bought immediately. So that is how the SISE looks at first locating it, status of it, inventory. And so the way that'll work in here in this tool is there'll be a link at the bottom that'll say inventory if it's available, and it'll pop in there. That's where we want to go. But this gave us a great capability to coordinate multiple agencies, multiple states, multiple companies, all using different systems. If they get to a browser, we can brief them on the latest information based on whatever the threat was. It's not the be all end all, but it was a heck of a lot better than trying to get everybody logged into our Esri software account. No disrespect to Esri, they got great stuff. This is built on Esri, but this served that unique swim lane that the private sector wanted to work with states and each other. Go ahead, Dave.
And Tom, I just wanted to add too that, I'll go over here. You noticed I turned the data set on, but at the same time, when we're done sharing it, we can turn the data set off. And when we turn the data set off, it goes off in the leader and it goes off in the follower. So that data is no longer there, and it can't be queried by the follower.
Yeah.
So this really puts the data sharing power in the hands of the data provider.
Yeah.
So this is a great opportunity to also expose more decision makers to different types of data and information through this on-off sharing.
Hey, and Chris, maybe you could comment. We're working on a brand new use case now for damage assessment. Chris is right in the middle of this. We can't name the companies, but they're pretty big organizations, I'd say. Chris, maybe you want to talk about that use case as far as on-off data sharing and how that might work in the use case coming up.
Yeah, so it's a really fascinating one and really important one. When we talk about damage assessment and emergency management, most of the time we're talking about the government. But as a matter of fact, a lot of private companies are doing even more robust and often faster damage assessment than the government agencies are, because they're about service restoration, which is critical. So it's really important for two things, and one of the scenarios that comes to mind is back in, I think it was 2008. There was a windstorm that went through Charlottesville, Virginia, and it knocked out hundreds of trees, paralyzed the town of Charlottesville, because as trees block the road, the typical response from the government is to send chainsaw crews out to clear the trees, but the trees have wires in them. And whose wire is it? So there was a very manual, laborious process about clearing whose wire was in the tree and getting it dealt with before the tree could be removed. These organizations are out doing their damage assessment at the same time. If they share what they're finding, which is about their infrastructure, the electrical wires or the telco wires or the cables or whatever, whoever the vendor is, and the government sharing what they're finding, where those collate, you now know this tree is down and it's this wire in it, and now we know who to coordinate with in order to get the situation cleared much more quickly. So it's a really, really important use case. The organizations are doing this anyway, but they've never been sharing the data, and they're doing it geospatially, but they've never shared the data. So now we're working with a couple partners to utilize this environment that we have through the SISE to share that information only during the incident, because these organizations are doing these kind of assessments all the time. They're actually more active than any government emergency operations center, because every time a thunderstorm happens, they're doing some sort of assessment and restoration. So in a called a multi-agency scenario, the agreement to share that information, and when the incident's over, they stop until the next time.
Right.
And they're sharing A to B, but they're assured that sharing is not going to happen B to C for the first time ever. And that's really, really exciting. It's exciting for the whole domain of disaster preparedness, and glad to be a part of it.
And within the SISE, there's 3 tiers of security. So tier 1 is pretty much for vetted users. Tier 2, which this will be our first one, requires a separate agreement, probably had penalties. It's kind of a no fooling around process, and the data owner, whether it's a utility or a communications company, they decide who's going to look at their data and for how long. They have control of the on-off button. So we're really pleased about this, because this has a massive impact on food, fuel, lodging, and everything else. For example, if a utility, who's one of the organizations, if they determine that the damage is transmission towers are down, that triggers a whole nother time frame of restoration and occupancy of hotel rooms and fuel, okay, than just a few poles are broken, right? So Chris nailed it. It's getting the sectors sharing specific pieces of information for a specific use case called damage assessment, right? And I have another Chalk Talk video, a link I'll share with you guys. That's why the use of use cases is so important, as Chris talked about, is people, when you ask people to share data, they have to know, hey, we're looking for a sliver of your data, not all your data. And we're going to share that with 5 people, and you get to pick them, right? It lowers the risk bar, and the SISE, if they do it within the SISE, it removes liability and it protects them against FOIA, right? Which is an issue for states as well as private companies. So again, having that legal framework makes that possible, and having technology, which today we have technology, and tomorrow might be newer technology, we don't know. But I think the key here is solving these problems is all about trust, and it's building this trust framework that private and public can use to solve these specific use case issues as they come up. And we got more than we could possibly ever address, but hopefully this gives you a feel for what we call on-off data sharing is really you, private sector, being willing to, share on-off data with the people you need to get it, your suppliers, your customers, whatever. That's kind of the big idea down the road. So I can see, Chris, Dave, we're gonna probably need a deep dive technical into this from a GIS technology standpoint. And the other one is probably the legal policy side of this, right? What is the policy? How are people protected? How do we protect them for you? How do we protect from other non-operational uses? So as you can tell, we've been working this issue for a long time, and I'm really glad we're able to touch on it. All right.
Well, yeah, it sounds great. And I would just add, Tom, that, the whole benefit of this on-off data sharing that you mentioned before is that when you turn it on, then the decision makers are exposed to the data and they can really advance their decision-making environment. It has an ORL associated with it. So if it's trusted, highly trusted, it has an ORL number, the decision maker doesn't have to say, well, where did this data come from? Who produced it? Do we really need to trust it? So they can really spend their time looking at the information and making rapid decisions.
Okay, I'd like to thank our panelists today, Dave, Tom, and Chris. It's not over. We have a few more minutes left for Q&A. And before we move to that, Tom, just wanted to ask you to make some closing comments about the SISE and next steps. Tom?
Oh, sorry. I didn't hear the Tom part. We invite everybody, if you are interested, to register with the SISE. There's no cost for it. This helps us get people connected with other people. We hold SISE exchange sessions, small virtual meetings, introducing people, connecting them, if you will, on a regular basis, once a week. So you'll get the opportunity to do that, introduce yourself and who you are, what you need during a disaster, and what you can bring to the table. It's really pretty simple. We stole that idea from Persia Payne Hurley in North Carolina. Always have to give her credit because it was an amazing thing what I saw her do at a FEMA conference. Secondly, it'll plug you into some of the products coming out of the SISE that you'll be able to know about. And a lot of that stuff's open, right? So to SISE, vetted SISE users, not to the general public. So SISEUSA.org, we invite you to register with it at no cost and plug into the community.
And just a reminder, if you have any questions, feel free to send it through chat or through Q&A. We've already received a couple. Keep them coming. We're not going anywhere for the next few minutes. And before we get to the Q&A, I just wanted to remind you that we're really enjoying doing these virtual discussions for you. So we're continuing to plan more and more. Our next one is going to be July 13th on logistics. And probably later that week, we're going to do one with communications with folks like Sprint and so on. So we'll reach out to you and let you know how to register for those. And I also wanted to give you my email address. So if you have any questions, solutions of your own, thoughts, ideas for webinars, feel free to contact Tom or I. I'm at laura.johnson@ahcusa.org. So I'm going to go ahead and move to our first question, which is from Scott. Scott, you've been super patient. I know you typed a little bit ago. But Scott's question is, he's familiar that we work with electric utilities via the SISE. Is there any pushback from investor-owned utilities or municipal utilities about sharing crew or outage information 100% of the time? And is there a component that some are more comfortable with an on-off approach?
Yeah, I'll take a first shot at that. Thanks, Scott. Glad you're able to join us. The answer is the Fleet Response Working Group started with trying to help get better information on power outage, where they were, crew movements. And quite frankly, it just got too risky. Information was so dynamic. And think about it, if you're a utility, if you make a mistake, it's public, okay? And if you're a regulated utility, public mistakes are costly. Image and brand, and they don't mean to, it's just too dynamic, okay? You put out one set of numbers at 10 a.m., 10:30, it's different, it's changed. Well, if I just log in at 10:30 and it's wrong, now I'm gonna be upset, right? So I feel for it, having come from the private sector, it was really hard. On-off data sharing is What we focused on is to get information that will help power restoration, not determine where the power is out, because that use case was too risky, too many cooks, and too dynamic, right? All of the utilities share on their public websites the best data they have at the moment. Is that the most accurate data? I don't know, but it just became a bridge too far. And we've learned in the SISE, we do three things. We take a use case we run it through the garden, 3 tests. 1, is it simple? Can we get a solution? Can we get something moving without a massive regulatory or directive or policy, whatever, okay? And that wasn't simple because it was so dynamic. The second thing is it's simple, number 1. 2, is it operationally beneficial? If we put all the energy to solve it, will it solve the problem trying to be addressed for the private sector or states? And 3, can we show over 90 days? Why? Because the SISE is a volunteer army. And if you don't show some kind of movement in 3 months, you don't have a group anymore. So when we started with power outages, that seemed to be the logical one, but about 6 or 8 months into it, we just realized, you know what, too complicated, huge operational value for an instant, and then it changes, right? So we said, all right, use case, we can get power movement and resource movement faster. And that was a home run. And all the utilities loved that because that was a big problem. So I don't know if I'm answering your question, but determining power outages is important. Don't get me wrong, because it's cascading impacts. There's a lot of people doing work. Scott, I know you're doing good work there. It was just something the SISE decided to move away from. Something quickly. It was just a bridge too far for us, not for anybody, but just for us. So I hope that answers your question.
All right, thanks, Tom. And we've went ahead and promoted everyone to a panelist. So you have the ability to unmute your own phones and say hello or ask any questions you want of the panelists. So feel free to go ahead and do that.
Laura, are you promoting, or I have?
I did everyone already.
I'm sorry?
I promoted everyone already.
Okay.
I was fast. You weren't looking.
Oh, you're quick. Yeah.
And Chris, I saw your doggy's tail. So I couldn't see the body, but I see you had a furry helper over there.
Learned to open the door to my office. It's a barn door that slides, so I can't keep them out now.
Aw.
Well, I could, but yeah.
Hi to Mary Lasky. I know Mary has been to our webinars before and typed in a hello. So welcome back, Mary.
Thank you. It's nice to be here and very interesting information. I do have a question. If you were to join, and it sounds like the information that you could put there is really secure.
Mary, you there?
Yes. Did you hear my question?
No, you blanked out there for a second. Your audio. Yeah.
So is it possible that if you joined, that you could put data and that it's very secure and that you could then say who has access to it and who doesn't?
If it's linked to an approved use case. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah, because
Thank you.
That's a great question, Mary, because we got hammered with, I got data. Private sector said, whoop, time out. It needs to align with a use case we have approved, or we could start a group around a certain use case. So this is where we talk with the data provider, say, what do you have in mind? Oh yeah, that goes here. So we could expedite that very quickly because we have to be able to scale over time. And so that's the kind of the rule, the governing rule about if it aligns with a use case, fantastic. Let's take a look.
And we could then create and ask you for a new use case if that was possible.
We would love an army of people to see our process and create their own use cases. Absolutely. The SISE isn't exclusive, Mary. It's made to be kind of a standard approach, but our hope is to have everybody that wants to create their own use cases and have their own committees utilize that. That was the whole purpose, is to create a standard to help everybody work together, not just people within, the consortium or the SISE or its partner work groups and so forth.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you, Mary. Any other questions? Don't be bashful. Go ahead and unmute your phone, and now's your chance.
Hey, Laura, it's Bruce Churchill. Can you hear me?
Yeah, Bruce, how are you?
Hey, Bruce.
Pretty good. How you guys doing? Hey, you were talking about the levels of data, and you mentioned tier 1, I think, was more open. Tier 2, what was the third tier? Just to complete the discussion.
Great question, Bruce. Third tier will require a PIV-I or above credential. So we don't have those yet. We actually started, Bruce, with tier 3. We got PIV-I credentials with a project we did with DHS Science and Technology. We badged up a bunch of people, about 70 states, I think about 9 states, a bunch of companies. And what we found out was it was too freaking hard. The states couldn't afford the credential. It was a technology nightmare. And that 3-month window was slipping away. Okay. So the private said, look, let's pause tier 3. Let's go down to tier 1 and let's get something done. Right. But tier 3 would require a separate agreement again, probably with penalties and probably with at least a PIV-I or above credential.
And PIV-I means what? I'm still writing.
I'm sorry, PIV. The federal government uses PIV, or CAC card, right? It's personal identity verification. It validates your identity 45 different ways. PIV-I is a step below that. It's used by states in commerce, and it validates your identity 25 ways, right?
Okay.
But it's like a TSA pre. You got to go. You got to get fingerprinted and photographed. It's no fooling around. It's serious, and you need equipment in your computer to use it. And it was a fur ball.
Yeah, we don't like fur balls, right?
Well, this is what's great about working with the private sector, because they'll be straight up with you. Hey, man, Tom, drop this now, okay? Or I'm leaving. I mean, this is kind of funny, it is, but they did us a favor.
Yeah.
Thanks, Bruce.
Yeah, thank you.
Anyone else?
Laura, I got a text about cyber use cases. Are we working on cyber use case? Okay, so cyber is another fur ball. But what the Fleet Working Group had several meetings about this, and they said, a lot of people working on cyber left of boom, detection, prevention like that. But who was working right of boom after something happens? Who is now working on a use case after that? How do we coordinate with states? How do we coordinate with feds? How do we resolve the issue? So their first use case came from the electric sector. Laura Shepis and Pat Hart at Edison Electric Institute started working, and COVID kind of put on hold, with Persia Payne Hurley in Florida on an exercise that would be like Hurricane Sandy during an election, with a cyber attack on the election system and the power grid. Crazy scenario. Out was in the state, there are 6 different agencies that would have to coordinate after a cyber attack: governor's office, emergency management, police, transportation, election system, the board. Anyway, I forgot what they were, but there was no mechanism to do that. So we do have a cyber use case. There's a video on it we've made here, but it's really looking at right of boom, because left of boom, there's so many people working that space that are much smarter than us. But we figured the people side and coordinating the people and educating, training the people to process and communication protocols would be more valuable. So that's our cyber use case.
Thanks, Tom. Okay. Well, I think we're all good. Again, Dave, Chris, and Tom, thank you so much for your time today and being panelists. This weekend is 4th of July, so happy Independence Day, everybody. We don't have any webinars next week due to the holiday, but we will after that. So keep your eyes and ears out, and stay safe, everyone.
And Laura, if anyone of a topic that we have not covered, right, I'd like to invite them to submit it in the chat or send us an email.
Yeah. All right, Tom. Thanks so much, guys.
Okay.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.
All right.